Thanks. I'm Billy. I'm an alcoholic. And straight off a plane, hamburger shoved down my throat in 2 minutes and on the podium. But good to be here. My sobriety date's January the 5th of 1990. My home group is the Early Morning A Literature Discussion Group in Atlanta, Georgia. And I have the charge of talking about the traditions, which I'll be perfectly honest, I was thinking on the plane here. So I was lucky the last 2 times that I spoke in like the last month and a half, I've had the doctor's opinion, which has been awesome because in 2018, in today's world in Alcoholics Anonymous, I seem to lose friends every time I get behind a podium and talk about the traditions. And not intentionally. I was recently away and I got to see June G. Thank God. We had a great conversation, her and I. Because, AA traditions and AA histories and AA's history are interesting, for sure. But her and I were talking about, running into the dreaded person who loves to take a line out of a book or a line out of a letter that Bill Wilson wrote. Or the last time it happened to me, I was behind a podium like this, and somebody challenged me that, yes, Bill Wilson did encourage that AA should have Bible studies, and he had seen this letter that Bill wrote, and he read it at the event I was at, and it took me like a month to get the archivist at GSO to go to that box of letters that sits in a storage facility because those aren't digitized yet, and it's so old-fashioned, it's on microfilm, and then they have to go down to the New York Public Library and use their old microfilm reader so that I could get a transcript of that letter, and once again, it's like what June and I had been talking about, that once again, 95% of what that person said was accurate. However, they left out the most important thing before they started reading what they said Bill said. Because right before Bill started talking about how it would be great if AA members want to get together and study the Bible, the opening line of that letter is, of course, if separate from AA and outside of Alcoholics Anonymous, some of our members would like to get together and study the Bible. That sounds like a great idea. But without that line, if you read the rest of that letter, it is very problematic if you're trying to get your view. And so sometimes I mention things that are, maybe might not be in line with other people's views. And we know today, and I'm not afraid to talk about it, that, let's face it, the recovery economy is not evil. And everybody that works in the recovery community is not evil. Even I don't believe that. However, we can't deny the size of the recovery for-profit community. It's tremendous. It was never, ever, I joke around a little bit about, but, Dr. Silkworth, God rest his soul, but he was born like 100 years too early. Dr. Silkworth died a pretty, I don't want to say poor, but let's just say not what we consider a doctor should die with. Dr. Silkworth died of marginal means and enough to get by, but in today's world, he'd be a millionaire. Easy. A couple of times over. No one ever really never guessed that the paid for recovery business would ever get as big as it has. And it's huge. You can just Google and find out the numbers. And again, I'm all for how can you be a member of AA and be against treatment? Since Dr. Silkworth ran a treatment center, and our founder went to a treatment center called Towns Hospital and had his spiritual awakening or experience there. And since that doctor who ran a treatment center has basically the opening couple of pages of our basic textbook. So I don't think you can be anti-treatment. I think the way the traditions were written is that we cooperate, and we don't criticize. So I don't try to criticize. I just try to put things in a frame of reference that you can't deny what's going on in the world around you. You can't say that certain things aren't going on. And, you know, if I look at my own life as an example, and when I came into Alcoholics Anonymous as a teenager in the 80s, which some people would consider, that was really the first treatment center boom. If there was the first one, it was during the 80s. And insurance was very different back then. I mean, my dad was a cop. There was no limits on how many times you could go to treatment. There was no, if you had government, civil service, Blue Cross, Blue Shield, or your dad worked for the phone company or wherever else, you could go to treatment as many times as you wanted. And so that was kind of the first treatment boom. But back then, and this is just my view, I share my experience, the world was very different. The few people that I would run into that worked in that industry were mostly people in their 60s or 70s who had recently retired, who had 30 or more years of sobriety, who just decided to retire, and this was something to keep them busy, and they felt good about what they were doing. Today, I can tell you, when I run into someone who works in the so-called treatment or recovery business, rarely do they have more than 5 years. Rarely. So for me to think that that doesn't have an effect on Alcoholics Anonymous is just insane. Or on how we do things. And it keeps going and going. What used to be called aftercare was called Alcoholics Anonymous. You went to treatment, and the aftercare was Alcoholics Anonymous. If you look at the recovery houses today that exist, there are some really good ones there, exceptional ones out there, because they believe in like what the recovery house movement was created to do, which was to provide people basic human things they need, like shelter and clothes and food, and that's it. And allow them to build the foundation in some 12-step program, including Alcoholics Anonymous. That started with a very good intention. But where we are today is that I will meet a young kid in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I ask him what his home group is. He tell me it's his house meeting. And I'm like, well, do you mean? What's your house meeting? Oh, that's where we all have to go once a week. We have a meeting in our recovery house, and some alumni come, and I'll say, is that an AA home group? Well, no, it's just our house meeting. And when I try to communicate in a delicate way that I would love to help you, but your house meeting can't be your home group. Like, you have to have a sobriety date, you have to have a sponsor, and you have to have a home group. And your home group has to be an Alcoholics Anonymous home group. It cannot be just some place that you check in. Now, I am glad that your house has a house meeting, but that has nothing to do with AA. I'm just glad that they're taking care of you and doing the right thing, and once a week want to make sure that you're doing the right thing. And so I'm glad. I'm a guy who's been homeless sober, so I'm glad that recovery houses exist. But aftercare was Alcoholics Anonymous. The purpose of living someplace was so that 4 or 5 months later, you would have a home group, you would have a sponsor, you would have a service commitment at your home group, and you would be an entrenched member of Alcoholics Anonymous. You'll notice in there, nowhere did I use the word network. No one worried about if you had a network. They worried about if you had a home group and if you had a sponsor. Somehow along the lines in the last 20 years, we've exchanged that network can fill in instead of that. It's a very different country. When the traditions were written, one has to remember that it was illegal in many states in this country for every alcoholic to be in the same room. So I just want to make sure I say that again. You have to read the traditions in historical context to know that in 1945, in many states in this country, it was illegal for all alcoholics to be in the same room if they were not all white. Like, that is a fact. That is a historical fact. In 1953, Bill Wilson chaired a sharing session on segregated meetings. If you are a history buff, go to the 53rd General Service Conference report, and it's in there. Because they were worried, how could they carry the message? And I love when I'm in a room like this because it has the hotel dividing walls. Because like one of the things they talked about that sharing session is, well, what about if we have a temporary wall, we both sit on both sides, but we leave the wall open like 6 feet and we can hear what's going on between, right? And one of the things that came as a result of that sharing session is just a lot of people believing you do whatever you have to get the message out there. We don't want people locked up and everything else, but you do what you need to do. But that doesn't mean we didn't have certain issues back then. And let's face it, AA is a microcosm of the community that surrounds it. Those morals and values outside the community will make its way in AA. And so in certain states in this country, there was some problematic times. Bill Wilson, when he wrote the third tradition, only cared about every alcoholic having a seat and right to membership. It was not about drugs. It was not about eating. It was not about sex. It was not about gambling. It was about people. Men, women, gay, straight, black, white, Christian, Jewish. Bill wanted to make sure that if you suffered from alcoholism, you were entitled to an uncomfortable chair and a bad cup of coffee. He felt that to his core. To his core. But today I hear people talk about the third tradition and they're talking about drugs and all this, and I'm like, that's not why the third tradition was written. We know everybody has to be an alcoholic. The historical context was to let everyone come in the room. Now, problems other than alcohol, I really like that pamphlet because it's very direct, and I think today's life in AA, we are surrounded with singleness of purpose challenges. Now, I sometimes get branded for being a liberal. That's fine. But I am not somebody who wants to, if you read Bill's early writings, especially read those essays in the Grapevine. Bill believed that every alcoholic or possible alcoholic was entitled to come to meetings for as long as it took for them to realize whether they suffered from alcoholism or not. It's nobody else's job. We are not judge, jury, and executioner. It is that person's job to decide whether they suffer from alcoholism. And it's our job to be polite and kind and a good neighbor until they reach that decision. But that becomes a sticky point in today's AA, which is why I love the group pamphlet. The difference between open and closed meetings. Anyone ever run into somebody who's not an alcoholic or working with somebody who's not an alcoholic, they know it and they didn't know if they could go to a closed meeting and somebody said, well, don't worry, just say you have a desire not to drink. Anybody ever hear that? That's not what the literature says. So let's go over who can go to a closed meeting. Closed meetings are for AA members only, or those who have a drinking problem and have a desire to stop drinking. That's what it says in the literature. You don't just get to say, well, I have some other problem, but I have a desire not to drink. No, you have to be an AA member or have both of those things, a drinking problem and a desire not to drink. Open meetings are available to anyone interested in Alcoholics Anonymous program of recovery from alcoholism. Non-alcoholics may attend open meetings as observers. Well, the last 20 years, boy, have open meetings changed. I mean, open meetings have become almost like All Addictions Anonymous meetings. And I say that because I want to make very clear, I am not for throwing people out of AA. I want those doors to be wide. I want anyone who thinks they have a drinking problem to come in and be given the time to find out if they suffer from this problem. But we've done a big disservice to a lot of the other 12-step programs. People talk, first of all, we talk bad about other 12-step programs in our own meetings. We talk down about NA and CA. We say arrogant things like there's no solution there. We say all kinds of things. Why would somebody want to go there? And imagine if NA or CA or some other 12-step program decided tomorrow, you know what? We're just going to start treating alcoholics, even if they don't qualify for our membership. We're just going to deal with alcoholics. How would we feel? We'd feel like, boy, those alcoholics' life might be in jeopardy. Are they going to be able to identify there? Are they going to be able to learn about the disease of alcoholism? But yet, we somehow think, in our fellowship, it became acceptable to sponsor someone who doesn't have alcoholism. Because we have the solution. Somewhere, I haven't found the literature, it's written somewhere, that if you have mastered steps 2 to 12, you can help anyone. But I have not read that anywhere. But there are people who believe that. But what's happening in the world today? More than ever, at least where I go to meetings, more than ever I run into people, I would say in the last 5 years, compared to like the 80s and 90s, where I run into a lot of people who are just shooting dope or taking opiates and really have never drank or have drank very little. I've never run into that more than I have in the last 5 years. And I know the opiate epidemic is sweeping the country for a couple of years now. But I say that because some would say, well, that's an outside issue. I'd say, well, that's an outside issue until you start sponsoring them in AA. Then it's an inside issue. And it's sad, and I have this conversation with people from all over the country. How sad is it when someone we know who is not an alcoholic, that we know from AA, ODs? If you're like me and you're on Facebook, you know. I'm sick of taking pictures of those posts of somebody I met in AA who was a non-alcoholic but who came to AA because they liked AA better and wound up ODing on heroin. That's like a big story today in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's happening all over. And I don't want to tell people to go to I don't want to kick people out of AA. I want to save their life. If they're an alcoholic, like I said, welcome, sit down, I don't care. If you need time to figure out whether you're an alcoholic, great. But if you show up to my home group and tell me that you are just an addict, a heroin addict, I am going to make it my personal responsibility, number one, that I keep NA and HA and DAA meeting directories in my car. Now, that's what I do. I also have made it a point to find a couple of people who are active in those fellowships that are doing the deal. The kind of people that would be at this event in that fellowship. I need to know who they are in my community. I can't just walk somebody out the door and say, you know what, you're not an alcoholic. I need to say, you know what, I need to check my ego. I care about you and your life so much. I need to get you into the hands of somebody who has a solution for your problem, because I don't. But instead we say, quick little things like NA sucks, or there's no solution there, or all kinds of things I hear in meetings, and there's just no place for that anymore. The fact of the matter is people are dying. For me, where I go to meetings, and I know they call it the heroin triangle where I live, but it's not the only place in America that has a heroin triangle. For me, the last 5 years of Alcoholics Anonymous, the only thing I can compare them to is the early 90s before there was medicine for AIDS and HIV. And it seemed like in AA, I knew 1 or 2 people a month who were dying, especially if you went to urban AA inside a city. Anyone that was not sober during that time in like Boston or New York or Philadelphia or San Francisco, LA, it was a very different world. People inside home groups were dying often. But for me, that's what the last 5 years has felt like. Like I've never seen more people OD that are members of AA in my life. And I wonder, are we doing a good enough job getting them the help that they need? So the other thing I want to talk about is affiliation. So affiliation, you can look up the dictionary definition, but basically, I think we all know what affiliate means. There's a difference between cooperating and affiliating. I'll give an example. If I go to a AA conference and somebody says, I want to thank the Thursday night candlelight meeting for work in the kitchen tonight. That's awesome. They're AA members. That's great. And I'm at an AA event. But what about when I'm at an AA event and somebody says, I want to thank all the guys from the so-and-so house? Well, then I think to myself, what does the so-and-so house have to do with Alcoholics Anonymous? Like, they might live there, but they all have home groups. Like, we should be talking about their AA affiliation, not their outside affiliation. I also have seen flyers in the last couple of years where things are co-sponsored by a treatment center and a district, or a treatment center and a home group. We don't co-sponsor events. We just don't do that. And you can take it so far. And I know I'm just throwing out examples. It's for other people to want to say. But listen, if you're sending 30 guys or girls to an AA convention with an advertisement on the back of their T-shirt or sweatshirt for your recovery house, I'm going to tell you, I think it's wrong. I think it's out of line. I actually think it's using people for your selfish purpose. We don't go take over events because we want to show what recovery house we're from. Now, I understand, and that's why I say that now I know if somebody is in a recovery house, I have to work triple as hard to welcome them to Alcoholics Anonymous and teach them what AA is and what AA isn't. Because what most of us know, if you've been here a while, the more important part of that question is what AA isn't. A lot of people seem to get what AA is. But learning what AA isn't is just as important and sometimes more. We don't ask the supermarket to donate hamburgers to our event so that they can list Alcoholics Anonymous on their list of charities they give to. We don't take other people's money. So affiliation is just, and again, I'm on the board of 2 recovery-based organizations. I believe I bring my principles to the table. I will tell you, I had to resign from one last year I had to resign from an organization, it doesn't matter their name, but they help students, college students who are sober, and they decided that they were going to get into harm reduction. And they were going to get into telling students that to drink is not to die. Like if you were in stage 8 of the college sober student program and you had been doing good, if you went out, you weren't going to go back to stage 1. Because someone in the paid recovery world said, no, you can't take away their 3 years experience they already had. They have all that sober reference time. And when I tried to share with them, yeah, but people die when they go out. Something was wrong with their recovery that they had to drink. But that was a personal decision for me. Let that organization do what it wants. But that's why it's so important that AA not be affiliated with any of it. AA just has to be AA. I want to talk about anonymity for a little bit because there's 2 kinds, and it seems we only talk about one. There's the kind found in the 11th tradition, which is pretty easy, press, radio, and film, which includes TV and the internet. And there's the kind found in the 12th tradition, which is the humility side of anonymity. I've left quickly, mind you, because I might have been a little judgmental. But I know what it's like to go to an AA event, and the speaker, who happens to be an AA member, is signing and selling copies of the book they just wrote. Like I have been to an AA event like that. Shame on the AA event for allowing it. But maybe they didn't know better. I've been to another AA event. If you think I'm lying, the next time you see Mari, just ask her. She'll tell you. She'll back me up. Because, the good thing about being with Mari that day is her response to it was worse than mine. So rarely am I around somebody like that. So it was good where I wasn't the worst. But her and I were at an AA conference. It was not at a big airport. It was at a small airport. And we were all getting picked up together. One big happy speaker family. And this other speaker is walking in the plane terminal with 2 newcomers behind him. They're both wearing a T-shirt, which is a silk screen of the book he just published. And they're both carrying shopping bags of the book he wrote. And I just think to myself, that's not AA. We don't do that. I've even come across some well-intended people who I like very much, but I know have been told, put that book away, because they were selling it at an AA event. We're just AA. And I think sometimes that's what's hard to really get excited about. On one hand, we're passionate and crazy and out there. But on the other hand, the traditions kind of keep a tent around the circus, so a little boring, right? We don't have T-shirts. We don't write books and sell them and sign them and there's no stand outside where somebody's signing books that they just wrote, right? We just don't do that. And so we take fame away. And yet the outside world embraces that, but we don't do that. And we don't own the word alcoholic regarding anonymity. I can go on TV or whenever I want, and I can say I'm an alcoholic. That is not a traditions violation. It's when I say that I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous that I have blurred the line. So does that mean I should tell everyone I'm an alcoholic? I think a lot of us know that again, I think network is not inherently bad. I know a lot of people in Alcoholics Anonymous. There's some I go to Yankee games with, some I ride motorcycles with, some of them go to my home group, some of them do not. Like, I'm glad I know all those people, but that's just the fellowship that I found, like the book talks about. Very different than being an active member of a home group. And it's gone on and on. It's moved so far from where it started. And basically what's happened is most of the things that we do, some other people decided you could make money at and get paid for. And inside Alcoholics Anonymous, the ripple effect has been, well, you know, if somebody has a financial motive, they're going to really strive to do that. And if you're newly sober or a year or two and trying to pay back all your bills and your court costs and all that other stuff, and you're doing it for fun and for free, the motive kind of changes. And now we have sober peer counselors. Like, I have people that I know, young people specifically, who tell me that they were offered a job for like 10 or 15 bucks an hour, and all they got to go is get this certification for like 10 hours, and they become some kind of sober peer. And again, I'm glad that they do that, but it has nothing to do with Alcoholics Anonymous. It has zero to do with Alcoholics Anonymous. And we have sober coaches, and I only say all those things because we can't deny that this has happened in the last 30 years, particularly. In the last 30 years, for fun and for free has kind of went off to the side. So some of the things that I might talk about, sometimes people get a little disturbed, I guess you could say. The other thing is when you say something, we're in Philadelphia, basically, across the river, home of Jimmy Burwell, author of A Vicious Cycle, most famous atheist in Alcoholics Anonymous, probably. Here in America, the most famous member from Philadelphia ever. If you go to Ireland, the person who founded AA in Ireland was a traveling businessman from Philadelphia, Connor. I'm forgetting his last name. But if you go to Ireland, they all know it. Like, he is the most famous. They don't know Jimmy Burwell. They know Connor. But I say that because Jimmy Burwell, had some challenges, but I don't think we could argue too much that those 4 words that I'm pointing to, as we understood him, could possibly be responsible for more people staying to go to their second meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous than any other 4 words anywhere. Long before someone reads a big book, long before someone gets a sponsor, long before someone decides they're going to join a home group, they go to their first meeting. And for real alcoholics, your first meeting is terrifying. And not terrifying it's like terrifying how pathetic all these people are in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's terrifying that they all look, when you're at your first meeting, like they're in some cult that you're not in. It's terrifying that, they laugh at certain things that other people don't laugh at. It's terrifying for a lot of reasons, but we also know for a lot of people, it's terrifying because if you never pick up a piece of our literature and just read what's on the wall, there are some drastic things there for alcoholics. I mean, I always say, I know we have the 40 questions, but if your prospect basically tells you that those 12 things are completely opposite than how they're wired, it's a pretty good chance they might be one of us, you know? I don't think we meet a lot of people who tell us, those 12 things, it's exactly what I was looking for. I couldn't wait to find God. I couldn't wait to take my own inventory. I couldn't wait to make a list of all the stupid things I did and people I hurt. Those are pretty drastic for a person at day one. The God thing seems to affect people even more, usually because of something involved in how they were raised or whatever. But people see God and they're like, I'm out. So those 4 words to a new person who comes to their first meeting, and without Jimmy Burwell, they might not be in the book. He held fast that needed to be there. And I say that because the complete opposite of Jimmy Burwell is the man who's the author of the story Our Southern Friend. That would be Fitz Mayhew. Now, Fitz Mayhew was the opposite of Jimmy Burwell. He was what you might call today an evangelical Christian. So Christian that the last 2 paragraphs of his story in the first edition are not in the second, third, and fourth edition. Got it. So here we have 2 people, Jimmy Burwell and Fitz, opposite AA spectrums. Both stories are in the big book. One an atheist, one a Christian. And yet, such good friends, they're buried in the same cemetery in Maryland today. Now, I say that because sometimes I think this word network, whatever it means, it seems like, on the other hand, inside AA, we've tried to create subsets inside AA. And I'm not really sure that's how it was in the beginning. Jimmy Burwell obviously did not believe in the same AA that Fitz did, but that didn't impact their friendship or their bond. And today sometimes I hear things said that are, I gave, June is on my mind because she emailed me last night, but I gave her a letter that she had never seen before. I'm going to read it to you because it's one of my favorites. Because how many times do we go somewhere where we hear somebody say, you have to do this, or this is the only way? That was not what Bill Wilson said by any stretch of the imagination. And of course, can I not find that letter now? That's fine. I can't find that letter now. But let me just look very quickly to see if I can find it. I have so many AA files, and I try to have the best file system by a million different little things. Here it is. I don't have in my official filing system Big Book Thumper, but that's what I called it, Bill's letter to a Big Book Thumper. But anyway, this is 1964. So we're 7 years before Bill Wilson will pass away. And somebody writes Bill, and then Bill actually met this person. And Bill decides to send him a letter after they visited personally. And this is what Bill's letter says. Dear Bob, our way, both as members and as groups, of practicing the steps appear to vary from time to time. Many of us lack thoroughness, which most evidently you do not. And I'm very glad that you have had such good results with the approach you've made. I have only one suggestion. This would be to avoid trying to force anyone into your particular approach. Your example of good results is apt to be much more effective with others than your insistence that they adhere or conform to your particular interpretation. Most of us alcoholics are apt to be all or nothing people. Shocking, even back then, right? We go to extremes. Either we want perfection by Thursday next, or we will waste only the barest bit of AA that will keep us sober. Experience seems to show that we can go broke on spiritual pride, or an unreasonable rebellion, or just plain apathy. A plain, everyday desire to make some progress is usually the best and safest bet. However, don't take what I say as gospel. You and everybody have the right to practice AA as you wish. This is our spiritual freedom. May God bless you, ever Bill. Now, you can go some places and you can hear some stuff where they would be having a motion to remove Bill Wilson from AA after hearing that letter, right? I mean, they would not want Bill to have a membership card. And I say that all the time today. I think sometimes people don't realize that Bill Wilson's out there thinking. He would barely be able to get elected an alternate GSR today. You know, he would barely be trusted to be the co-coffee maker. He was a free thinker. And, you know, as I start to talk about the traditions, that's really the balancing act with the traditions. Is how can you, which the first tradition is clear in the 12 and 12, and probably, except for holding some things I need to look at, the only time I'll reference the 12 and 12 today is tradition 1, which says, does this mean, some will ask, does the individual not count for much in AA? Is he to be dominated by his group and swallowed up into it? We can certainly answer this with a loud no. We believe there isn't a fellowship on earth which lavishes more devoted care upon its individual members. Surely there is none which more jealously guard the individual's right to think, talk, and act as he wishes. That's pretty open freedom there. From Bill, who labeled himself a benign anarchist from word go. I mean, but we kind of have these kind of shoulders of the road, we can call them, if you want to look at the traditions that way. Are they all black and white? No. But they're shoulders of the road to keep us from going too far off, whether as a home group, a member, a district. They're to really keep us from driving into a tree. That's the easiest way I could put it. Now, along with that comes people who want them to be rules and explicits. And then there's the opposite people. They only believe there's one tradition, or they believe there is a super tradition. They look at tradition 4 and believe that somehow there's an asterisk there, and that tradition 4 is the ultimate veto power for any group to do whatever it wants. There are, I mean, you can be in a business meeting, a district meeting, you can be wherever, and you will hear people say, well, we have autonomy. You will hear that. Now, I brought a couple of pamphlets because sometimes, you know, when I talked about that Bill Wilson letter, sometimes you can go to certain places in AA and you feel like you're at a McCarthy-era book-burning ceremony. Like, they would like every piece of literature in Alcoholics Anonymous burned except for the big book. They proudly will say that the 12 and 12 has watered things down, and I'm not going to get into that debate today. I will say this. There are a couple of pamphlets that are without question awesome. And what's great about them is they have the group conscience of AA written right in them. And so the Traditions Illustrated, if you don't like the 12 and 12, it's too esoterical, it's too old, whatever. If you don't like to read books, whatever, fine. I'm not going to tell you. But I'm going to tell you that calling this the 12 Traditions Illustrated is kind of false advertising. Because you can see that the illustrations are really, they're not a lot. There's a lot of great writing in there. And the writing gets right to the point. It's like Tradition 4 I talked about. I love it in the fourth tradition because they talk about the C word, and not the one we grew up with not saying, but the C word in Alcoholics Anonymous, which is customs. And the difference between a custom and a tradition. Your group may ask people to dress up. That's a nice custom. Your group might have a sheet cake for anniversary night. That's a great custom. Your anniversary night might actually be the last Friday night of the month. That's a good custom too. But it's not a tradition. And the fourth tradition only applies to customs. You cannot use it to break another tradition. It's not some kind of like superpower that you decide, we don't like this, we're going to do that. So I think I just want to say from the start, if you've never really given the traditions a read, look at the Traditions Illustrated. It's amazing. Now, I sometimes hear people say, I don't agree with what it says. I think that's awesome. But what are you going to do about it? Are you going to be and just say, you know what, I'm just going to go against what the rest of AA says? Or maybe you could go to your district and you could send in an agenda item to the General Service Conference and say, I'd like to change that. I'd at least like AA to talk about it. So I love that pamphlet. I also love A Member's Eye View. One of my favorite pamphlets. I just think there's very few other pieces of our literature that get right to the heart of the matter about how we view AA. Understanding Anonymity, God knows we should give these out 5 a newcomer today, it seems. But this is a great pamphlet. And of course, my favorite pamphlet, the AA Group, which I think should be inside every big book that's sold. I looked in my suitcase today. I do not have a problems other than alcohol, but I can assure you that gets its proper place in my group of favorite pamphlets because I think we don't like to say things black and white in AA. We're very gray. We have a lot of mud. But in some of those pamphlets, on the really important tradition topics, they remove the gray. On the things that really matter to us, they extract the gray. And those are a couple of the things I want to talk about today. So let's just, for those that may have never, ever heard anything about the traditions before, it's important to know, and I know this is going to go, again, it's going to go against certain things that certain people say in AA, but you can go to certain places in AA, and they will tell you that the way they did it in 1935 to 39 is perfect. Now, there's a couple of problems with that statement. Or you'll hear people say, I want the program the first 100 had. There's a lot of problems with that statement. You would have to identify which one of the first 100. Because although your big book says this is how over 100, the truth is 100 people didn't stay sober until that book was printed. Let's just be very honest about that. There was actually only about 43 people involved with writing the big book. And only about 21 of them stayed continuously sober until the book was published in April of 1939. Now, if I'm telling you there is only one way to do it today, there was no such thing as a highlighter in 1939. I don't know if you all know that, but in 1939, the highlighter had not been invented yet. Now, I'm not against highlighters. I carry for work every day. I even have one I can use on PDF Expert, so I have a digital highlighter for contracts, but highlighters did not exist in 1939 or 38 or 37. So while it's nice to have highlights in our big books, it might help you study the book, which is great, but let's not confuse that with our real history. The other thing I think that we have to realize is 1935 to 1950, and really 1935 to 1945, but almost to 1950. I'll throw out the first trivia question of the day. Does anyone know the description or words that Bill Wilson used to call that period of time in Alcoholics Anonymous? Flying blind. That's not my words. Those are Bill Wilson's words. The flying blind period. Hard to imagine that it even stayed around until the traditions were written. So when we talk like that there was this perfect Shangri-La of Alcoholics Anonymous, a reading of our history will show you, and it'll reassure you. You know when's a perfect time to read Not God or AA Comes of Age? After your home group completely drives you crazy. Because when your home group has completely driven you crazy, or someone in AA has completely driven you crazy, when you read those two books, you will be reassured that nothing has changed. That has been going on since the start. And so then there's some other stats that we throw around that are taken out of context. That you can go to certain workshops and people want to focus on the percentages in the forward to the second edition of the Big Book. The percentages that say, oh, back in the day, this percentage of people, they got sober right away. And this percentage of people, they came back, and this percentage of them stayed. But that's not what it says. The book says, of those who really tried. It's not talking about everyone who ever came to an AA meeting. It's of those who really tried. And by 1945, I assure you, Bill Wilson was very worried about the future of Alcoholics Anonymous. There were many things going on that were in our path. First of all, people hear all the time, I'm guessing that everyone in this room has heard the name Bill W. before I mentioned it today, right? Okay. And I'm going to guess that everyone has heard the name Bob S. Fair enough. And I'm going to guess that at least probably in a room like this with the kind of AA lunatics that come to an event like this, right? That I'm going to say the passion in this room, I'm going to say that if I throw out the name Nell Wing, I'm going to say 50% of you probably know of Nell Wing. But what about if I throw out the name Bobby B? Who's never heard that name? Okay. So Bobby B. If you look at the Christmas letter that Bill and Lois sent out from the office in 1945, you will notice that it is signed loving, affection, whatever, Bill, Lois, and Bobby. Bobby really, she kept that office running during the early 40s. Without Bobby, we don't make it. Especially while Bill was having some challenges, battling depression and other things, Bobby kept the tent around the AA circus. Now, unfortunately, she had her own breakdown. And in typical AA fashion, we hardly mention her in our history. This is a woman who sacrificed everything. An alcoholic, too, at that. So the 40s were not going so well. We had groups that had membership rules. We had groups that had sponsorship rules. We had all kinds of things. And I always tell you, because it's a true story, I always say it, that at that time, it was very common. Bill would talk about it. If you get some of Bill's talks, if you listen to enough of them, he would joke around and say that he would get a letter from two groups right across the street from each other. And the letter would say the exact same thing. Dear Bill, everything's going great here. Our group's on fire. We're working with newcomers. We're bringing meetings into the local jail. The only problem we have is that group across the street. We have no idea how they stay sober. And Bill would joke around that a week later he'd get the same letter from the group across the street. Everything was going fine there except for the group across the street. But Bill saw all of this going on. And so if you don't have a Grapevine subscription, it's not my job to tell you to get one, but I will tell you that the AA Grapevine archives that are online are phenomenal. Because every single Grapevine article ever written is published there. And if you join the online archives, you can get access to it. And so if you put in the word, and you can search things by topic: anger, resentment, powerlessness, allergy, all this stuff. If you even search traditions, the first things that will come up will be the 12 essays that Bill wrote in the Grapevine between like 1945 and 1948. Those essays I strongly suggest to people because they're basically what's in the 12 and 12, just not cleaned up as much. They're very to the point. And what I also like about those essays is Bill weaves a theme through those 12 essays. And the theme is, the only reason we have these is for the new person not here yet. The only reason I'm concerned with us all getting along together is not because I want us to get along. That was never Bill's view. He didn't want our crazy personality conflicts and egos to do something so that somebody coming to AA would not have AA to go to. That was his biggest concern, or fear, if you want to use that word. And so Bill writes those 12 essays. And then in 1950, at the Cleveland Auditorium, the traditions are ratified. And then in 1955, AA comes of age and the trustees give over power from really the early founders to the groups day to day. And so we've really had these traditions, give or take, let's call it 67 years. If we use 1950 as kind of like a demarcation line, even though those essays were written, but between 1950 and today, we've had the traditions. And again, I say to people all the time, the other reason we have these traditions, especially, I'll go back to understanding anonymity. There's a lot of things that we talk about inside Alcoholics Anonymous regarding anonymity. We don't want AA's reputation based on any of us individuals, number one. We don't want anyone being the poster guy or poster gal of Alcoholics Anonymous. We don't want anyone speaking for AA in the general public. But those are all things to kind of help protect AA. What we don't talk about a lot is real alcoholism and tie it to the big book. That the big book talks about a disease called alcoholism. And as you proceed past the doctor's opinion and Bill's story, and on page 21, the description of the real alcoholic, and go into there is a solution, and you go into more about alcoholism, you get a real understanding. I mean, the whole purpose is you can't fix if you don't know what's wrong. Now, sometimes, again, in certain places, I will go to places where I hear things that are not backed up by literature or history. My favorite one, probably, I will again go back to the step shade, is when someone with like 2 years wants to raise their hand and chastise everyone else for being an untreated alcoholic, and let everyone know that alcohol is only mentioned in the first step. That statement drives me crazy. The lack of respect for not only alcohol, but alcoholism, that might be a true statement if you've never read the big book. Specifically the first 110 pages. If you have read the first, depending on the edition you have, the actual steps up to working with others are 106, 110 pages. If you were to start reading and count how many pages of those early chapters are dedicated to the first tradition, to the first step, to the allergy, to alcohol, Polly just said 42. I would just challenge anyone, because I've tried to quit the debating society, but I can tell you, you won't be able to go under 40. You won't. You won't. It's simple math to divide 106 by 40. The first step is not like 1/12 or 1/10. You have to know what's wrong with you before the other steps will help heal you. It's imperative. You can't glance over drinking or alcoholism or the allergy. For most of us, we know that alcoholics are so thick-headed that until you really know how serious alcoholism is, why would you want to do the rest of the work after those 40 pages? You really have to know that it's a do-or-die situation. There's no other way out. And so, but I sometimes worry that when we talk about the traditions, we don't talk about the real alcoholic. That a lot of this is about the real alcoholic, that we're wired differently. I'm sure most of you know that. The book says we're wired mentally and physically, but we could take that we could do a whole workshop on that, right? For 3 days. We could have a whole weekend. How wired differently are alcoholics, right? But we know one thing is we all have one thing in common. We have to have the physical allergy and the mental obsession. Without those two things, there is no alcoholism. You need those two things to have alcoholism. You can have an alcohol problem, you can be a heavy drinker, you can have lots of other things. But to be what we deal with in AA, you need both of those things. But there's a lot of things for us that are off the table as alcoholics. And as I start to go through each tradition one by one, I'll just jump, though, to anonymity. Real alcoholics are not wired to handle the fame of being famous for being sober. Not if you suffer from the real spiritual disease that is outlined in the book. We don't have the DNA to live with that. It's a death sentence for us. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but it's a death sentence. Even in early AA, you can read stories about a professional baseball player and others who decided they were going to be famous for being sober and paid the ultimate price. They lost their life due to alcoholism. So sometimes I think we should focus more on how these are tied to our life as real alcoholics than rules. So let me jump to a couple of things that I want to get out of the way, and then I'll go back to some others. But I want to start with singleness of purpose. And I want to start specifically with the third and the fifth tradition, because I don't have a full day to do a full traditions workshop here. So I want to make sure there are certain things that I do not forget to say. Spilled some peanuts. So, the long forms of the tradition, there are people who would argue that the short form has caused a lot of trouble. Some people believe that. I probably believe it some days. But I understand and accept why they created the short form. But it wasn't meant to be one against the other. It's just an abbreviation that fits on a shade. That's all it is. It's an abbreviation that fits on a shade, you know? I mean, I try to tell people, if you drive through a neighborhood and there's a stop sign, you have to stop, right? That's the law. In certain neighborhoods and communities, they've started to put red lights around the edge of a stop sign. And in certain places, they blink. However, there is no difference between the interpretation according to the judges at motor vehicle court. It's a stop sign. One has lights so that you can see it a little bit easier. One does not. But you don't get to roll through the one without lights, right? It is a stop sign. Same with the short form. The long form and the short form, you have to be talking about both together. You have to be looking at them. And the third tradition is probably one that gets taken out of historical context much more than any. The short form, the only requirement, this side, for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. But I do want to read the long form of that tradition, just because I think it's so different that people don't pay attention to it sometimes. The long form says, our membership ought to include all who suffer from alcoholism, period. Hence we may refuse none who wish to recover, nor ought AA membership ever depend upon money or conformity. Any 2 or 3 alcoholics gathered together for sobriety may call themselves an AA group, provided that as a group they have no other affiliation. So it's very clear. In order to be an AA member, you have to have alcoholism. Only alcoholics have alcoholism. I've gotten that question before. Well, it says only those who suffer from alcoholism. Well, maybe I suffer from alcoholism, but I'm not an alcoholic. Well, according to the medical community, that's impossible. You have to be an alcoholic to suffer from alcoholism. Just throwing that out there. But I do think I am one of those people who believe for a long time we have focused too much on the negative. Like, I don't care what people's other problems are. It has nothing to do with the requirement to be here. We have a qualifier. We do not have a negative disqualifier. If you're an alcoholic, welcome. You're entitled to membership. And I say it all the time, wherever I am. I've never met anywhere in any part of this world any alcoholic who's been willing to tell me that the only problem they have is alcoholism. I've just not met that person. Maybe today will be the first day someone's going to come up and tell me, you know what? I really only have alcoholism. But that doesn't mean that I think everybody is also a drug addict. What that means is it doesn't matter what your other problem is. But if you're going to be a member, you have to have at least the one that you need to have membership. You can have any other problem in the world, but you need to at least be an alcoholic to be an AA member. Now, I'll tell you, read Bill's early writings on these because they're genius. The third tradition had nothing to do with alcohol or drugs. The world was a very different world. The country, specifically, was